I know we have as well a drawing and a few more announcements at the end of the presentation by Tessa. So if you could stay online afterwards, that'd be great. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague Tessa, who works in our research and instruction department. And Tessa, if you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, everyone. I'm so surprised that there are so many people here at the end of the day. Thanks for sticking with me. Today, I'm going to be talking about validating a small but mighty information literacy assessment. So here, I'm going to leave this on the screen for a moment. Hopefully, you had a chance to take the assessment during the break, but there's a QR code here that you can use on your mobile phone, or there's a shortened link at the bottom here. And I know some people are just coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to that in the chat again. So again, my name is Tessa Withorn. I'm the science librarian at the University of Louisville, which means that I'm the liaison librarian to the STEM departments in our College of Arts and Science. So that includes biology, which I'll be talking about today, but I also work with chemistry, geographic and environmental sciences, physics, astronomy, and math. So I have a lot of fun with those things. I also do a little bit of instruction around research data management. So today I'm going to be talking, as I mentioned, about validity. So I'm just going to kind of clarify the difference between validity and reliability. These terms are often talked about together, but they do mean different things. So it's helpful to remember that validity is whether you're measuring what you intended, whereas reliability is that measurement consistent over time? So in terms of validating a test instrument, which is what this 10-question assessment would be considered, one of the methods that you can use is just consulting content experts and as well as testing with students. So these are the two methods that I'm going to be talking about today. But I do want to point out this citation, this Mary Newby and Pang article assessing the reliability and validity of a locally developed information literacy test, which is a little bit older. It's from 2011, but this article really inspired me to kind of take control over validity and really feel like an expert myself. It may seem like validation and reliability are these really time-intensive processes, but it's actually very accessible and you can kind of consider yourself as an authority as well. I do also want to mention that reliability is a comparison under the same conditions. So I'll talk about how that's a little bit in the next steps of my work with this assessment, but that's something that I will be talking about later. I just want to cover a few types of validity as well, too. So there's lots of different types of validity, but some of the most common ones are content validity. And this means that you're covering the entire range of a subject matter. So in this case, it would be information literacy. You'll see in my assessment that I also connected a lot of these questions to the ACRL framework, which is considered construct validity because that kind of focuses on theoretical frameworks that are informed by your assessment. There's also face validity, which is a superficial assessment by non-experts. And in this case, I'll be talking about students taking the assessment. And there's also a lesser common but still important type of validity criterion related validity, which is where you can pair a test with another validated assessment. So this is not something that I have done, but something I could do. I want to point out the citation here as well. I really relied heavily on SAGE research methods to learn more about test validity. If you have access to that, I would strongly recommend checking out some of the book chapters and reference sources there. And if you don't have access, email me and I'd be happy to send you a chapter of that. I just want to jump in now to the actual assessment. So this is a 10 questions assessment, but you'll notice that I asked a few extra things of you all today to help me validate this instrument. So you can see the test questions here. And then I asked, do you think this question accurately measures an ACRL frame? I know we have more than just academics here. Hopefully you're at least familiar with the ACRL framework in some ways, but these are 6 frames that are related concepts with knowledge, practices, and dispositions that we use in higher ed, but there's a lot of crossover with research-related skills for all grades. I then asked how difficult you would rate this question, so I'm interested to see what you all say for that. And I just want to point out at the very end, there are 2 other questions in this assessment besides just the 10 multiple choice questions. And that is, what do you think is the most important skill you've learned about conducting research, which is an open-ended question, as well as if you've ever had library instruction from a librarian before. I'll talk about how that is important. And then also including that unsure if in case students don't know. So I'm going to jump into the back end and see what you all had to say. I'm not going to go over all of these questions, but I do want to point out a few of them. So let's run a little background of this first question around credibility. Let me refresh because I think hopefully some of you are able to take it. Here we go. Yes. So which of the following is the most important factor for you to consider when evaluating the credibility, i.e. reliability or trustworthiness of a source? And you all mostly got it right, the reputation of the author and or publication. But I see a few other answers too, which I assume maybe is some people trolling me a little bit, but maybe not. So let's see if people think that this accurately measures the authority as constructed in a contextual frame. I really didn't know what to expect with your all's responses at all, so this is really interesting to me that some people said yes, but some people said no, and I would love to hear in the discussion at the end why you think that might be. And then we can also look at the difficulty of the question. There's a full range here. So 1 would be very easy, 5 being very difficult, and it seems like there's some range of answers here, but kind of leaning towards the easy side. I'll show just a few more questions. So another one that I'm interested to hear your all's feedback on is this question. Let's see, let's do the research question. So which research question is an appropriate scope, i.e. not too broad or too narrow? Most of you got it right. What are the nesting behaviors and habitat preferences of northern mockingbirds? Let's see if that accurately measures the frame research as inquiry. We had lots more people say yes, so maybe that's a little bit clearer of an alignment with the framework. And let's see how difficult you thought this was. Leaning more toward easy for this one as well, which is interesting. And then I'll show just one more that is a little bit more STEM focused. So I'm curious to hear what you all thought about this question about retractions. So what does a journal do when a research article is retracted? And it looks like most of you got that right. Issues a formal notice explaining the retraction and label the article as retracted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about revisions that I made to this question to make it a little bit more valid, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then you all rated that question, let's see, as not measuring, it's split. Information creation as a process or authority is constructed and contextual. And then for the difficulty, this is leaning a little bit more toward more difficult, which is something I expected you all to say too. So thank you for kind of going through this process of test validation. I'm really interesting. I'm getting really excited to dive into that later. I'm going to look at all of your all's responses. So thanks for participating in that. But hopefully it gets you an idea of some of the things that I was measuring with this assessment as well. So I just want to make a few comments about assessment overall, and then I'll get into kind of the process that I went into developing this assessment. So there are a lot of different ways that librarians do assessment. There are a lot of different models. I want to call attention to this model developed by Megan Oakleaf in this article, and she kind of revises this to talk about the reflection of the process overall. So it's not necessarily always a linear perfect circle like many models are not actually representing. But I just want to point out that a lot of times assessment is really grounded in identifying learning outcomes. We know this is a best practice in instruction, starting with learning outcomes with that backward design element as well. Then creating learning activities, enacting those learning activities. I sometimes call these interventions, which I think is helpful to think about. I know that's kind of borrowing things from the clinical world, but that's another way you can frame it. Gathering data and checking learning, interpreting the data, and enacting decisions. So this is kind of the cyclical process of how we use assessment to inform learning and learning interventions. I also think it's important to recognize, though, that librarians have lots of different feelings about assessment, and I want to give a shout out to my colleagues Amber Willenborg, Rob Detmering, and Samantha McClellan, who have this really awesome article, Real Talk, Librarian Perceptions of Professional Conversations on Information Literacy Assessment. So one of their major findings, and there's lots of interesting stuff in there, but one thing they found is that many respondents described IELTS assessment conversations using affective words such as overwhelming, frustrating, confused, but also hopeful. I would love to hear some of the words that you associate with assessment. I'm not looking at the chat today because I'm only on a laptop, but I hope to look at the chat after this session. So feel free to chime in and say some of the words that you feel when you think about assessment. I know I, for one, have been doing assessment work for several years now. I think it started out for me as being very intimidating. There's all these different types of assessments, what is most effective, what has the strongest claims. That's something that I've really been learning over time. And It also really depends on your institutional context, which is something I'm going to be talking about today, which might change how you feel about doing assessment on your campus. I also want to touch on a few other types of assessment that I chose not to do, though. So one of those, and maybe you've heard of this, is the standardized test, the Threshold Achievement Test for Information Literacy, or TATL. I went to a webinar recently to learn more about it because I didn't quite know, and it has 4 different modules that do align with the ACERL framework as well. But I think there's a lot of criticism around this test for being too standardized. I thought it was also a little sus that it was made by a company that doesn't really have transparent methods of how they developed this assessment or who actually came up with the questions. So that's one thing. But there's also a lot of barriers to using some of these proprietary standardized tests. It is $8 per student, which is kind of exorbitant. I don't know who has the money to do that. But there are also some other easier types of assessment that I think a lot of librarians are already implementing. So one of those most common is a pre-post test. Maybe you have a reflection at the beginning or end of a one-shot session, or maybe you compare responses to a tutorial before and after. I do find some issues with pre and post tests in the context of library instruction, just because a lot of times our interventions are so small, it's very hard to accurately measure what students are really bringing in terms of their IL research skills. For example, maybe they have test anxiety, or maybe they had better preparedness in high school, but we really don't have the information of that context to really know if we're accurately measuring IL skills. I do want to mention rubric assessments, though, which is one form of authentic assessment, which is kind of how that's phrased. And that's looking at final products of students' work and looking at different criteria and grading those criteria, usually around like initial, emerging, expert, those types of categories. I have done rubric assessment before, and I found it really valuable and meaningful, but I think there's a lot of barriers in trying to get those student products from faculty. That's an extra step that faculty might not be willing to do, or it requires a lot of buy-in to be able to do that. So at this point in my relationships with faculty, I haven't been able to do rubric assessment, but that is something that I'm very interested in. But I think ultimately, why did I do this little 10-question test? Assessment will rarely be perfect. And I really strongly started to feel that something was better than nothing. I really wanted to get to know what students know. I've only been at U of L for a year and a half, so I've worked with students in various capacities, but I really have no idea whatsoever what they're coming in with. But I also want to ground my assessment approach in feminist pedagogy. So I love this quote by Maria Accardi: "Our goal should be to use assessment as a tool for advocacy and change, ensuring that all students have equitable access to the resources and support they need." So while I have some ulterior motives that I'll talk about in terms of running this assessment, but ultimately assessment really should be grounded in a student-centered approach that really focuses on equitable access. So to talk a little bit about the timeline of this assessment, I started U of L in the spring of 2023 and very quickly reached out to instructors, seeing if I could teach their classes, do one-shots. There wasn't a lot of opportunities in biology in particular. There were large sections, but they didn't really have research assignments. But I was able to build some relationships with some of the honors section instructors for this particular class, Biology 242, Diversity in Life. This is a required class of biology majors. There's regular and honor sections, but they were willing to pilot this tutorial with some students. And I'll talk a little bit about the results of that, but only about 24 students took this assessment in spring. So I had a little bit of data, but there's lots more biology majors that I wasn't able to reach in that particular point of their major. So that's something I was considering as well. However, I did get buy-in in the spring of 2024 with some of the new instructors that were teaching Biology 242. They had kind of gotten to know me through other ways that I was doing outreach with the biology department. So I think that really helped lend me some credibility once I had been there a little bit longer. So I met with those instructors, kind of talked initially about doing the tutorial again, but I had kind of reached out to them in the middle of the semester where it wasn't very easy for them to then plug in a tutorial. And they just like weren't that into it, which is fine. But they were really interested in what I was saying about wanting to know what students knew in terms of information literacy skills. So I had kind of thrown the idea out there. Could we do a small assessment? And all of them were game and were really interested in doing that. So after I got that buy-in, I very quickly tried to draft and look at kind of developing this test. And I, at the time, was reading a lot about test validity and wanted to really make sure that my test was measuring what I was hoping it to measure. So I'll talk a little bit about the revision processes that I went through to kind of further validate that test. But unfortunately, this little barrier in my timeline was unfortunately IRB. I drafted the assessment pretty quickly after and kind of got some feedback from students and some other librarians. But I kind of quickly put together IRB. It was really interesting. It went through multiple revisions, and there's a lot of like feedback on minute like spellings of words, and like it was a little frustrating to deal with, I have to be honest. But unfortunately I did not get it approved for IRB for the spring. So I will be talking about trying to launch this assessment later in the fall or in the following spring. So that is something to keep in mind. If you want to use any of the assessment data that you gather, you really should go through the proper channels of submitting an IRB proposal. Usually this type of assessment, though, is considered normal instructional practice. So usually it's either expedited or exempt. I did kind of put together, and you saw in the assessment, I included that there for you so you can see the exact language that I plan to use. To get student consent, it would be considered unsigned consent, so I wouldn't have to collect signatures. They would just opt in by taking the survey. But that was one of the barriers and one of the major considerations if you're trying to do something similar, to really plan for lots of time to do this. I tend to try to act very quickly, but in academia, I am very often slowed down, and that's okay. We'll get to it at some point. So I want to talk a little bit about the initial educational intervention that I was working with. I think I came from a background of online learning, so I love a good LibWizard tutorial. I could do a whole nother session on those tutorials alone, but just to give you an idea, this was with honor students in mind, but I really wanted to make it a baseline of, the research process. They were expected to use scholarly sources in some of their later assignments. So the tutorial went over finding academic databases, using search strategies in Science Direct, and then evaluating scholarly sources. But I did something really interesting that I'm starting to do with some students is I really like to subscribe to the approach of using lateral reading for evaluating sources. It's, been proven to really help students understand fact checking and understanding and thinking about the context and credibility of sources, and really using external sources to determine the credibility rather than some of those superficial markers of authority that are the main focus of things like the CRAP test. So in doing lateral reading, I had them look at an academic source and talked a little bit about how to read academic sources. But then I showed them an article from Retraction Watch about how this Nobel Prize winner had retracted 4 papers. And I think that's a process of scholarly communication that I kind of anticipated students didn't know as much about, but really gets them to question that even academic sources, which I think oftentimes initial emerging students and faculty kind of focus on, use academic sources. They're always great. They're always credible. And we know that that's not always the case. So I was trying to add some critical elements that I thought would honor students would be receptive to. But looking at some of the multiple choice questions that were in the tutorial, I noticed that, they were kind of learning in the tutorial throughout the whole process. But they were still answering on a first attempt, not always the correct answer. So you can kind of see a little bit of a benchmark. I want to point out that the lower score for this recommended databases, I was really surprised about. The activity in the tutorial is explicit directions on how to get to our database list from our library website and using filters to find biology recommended databases. And it was kind of an obvious answer that I think it was like Science Direct was the answer. But I did throw a little bit of a curveball in there and included JSTOR, which isn't necessarily a recommended database that I would recommend for STEM students, but I think it's one that students are really familiar with. And if they were going through the tutorial quickly, they might have just seen JSTOR and thought that was good and moved on. So I don't know that for sure, but that is one of my guesses. But they were really good at following directions to find the number of search results that a particular search string generated, and they were also pretty good at identifying keywords and lateral reading. I'm just going to pause really quick because I see some chats. I see some good conversation. I'm going to return back to that at the end of the session, though. So keep adding to the chat. Excited to talk more about this later. So, a little bit more context. I've mentioned some of this already, but it was very difficult because there's kind of always a different group of biology instructors teaching this 200 level class. So, it's really hard to try to keep a tutorial consistent throughout different semesters. So, as I mentioned, unfortunately, in the fall semester, that section there was only a few sections in the fall, but even in the spring, like I mentioned, the new instructors didn't quite get on board in time to integrate it as an assignment, so the tutorial wasn't assigned. But in my conversation with faculty, I learned some really interesting things. And a lot of the faculty were expressing sentiments that, they had these resuscitation sections where, they had the large lecture class and then they had smaller group resuscitations with graduate assistants. And they did tell me that the graduate students do talk about the library and library resources, and they also do a lecture about the crop test. And they really thought that this was sufficient. As I mentioned a little bit about why I choose to teach more about lateral reading rather than kind of these acronyms and these superficial markers of evaluation, which I think is definitely the trend in library instruction right now. I had to be like, oh, like we don't really do that anymore, and kind of here's the reason why I would teach it differently, and this is what it would look like, and they were receptive of that. But it really begged the question, like, do I even need to be involved either at this phase or in other places in the curriculum? Is librarian led intervention even needed? It's not necessarily the main focus of that biology 242 class. Research is a small component, but is this a appropriate place to be introducing information literacy concepts? I definitely thought yes, but I still kind of was thoughtful enough to think that, maybe I need to be focusing my efforts more on the capstone classes or other areas of curriculum. But the new instructors, when I mentioned that I wanted to do an assessment, they were really game. All of the instructors of all the sections I met with and agreed to run the assessment. And that would mean I would have a pretty decent sample size of 300 students or more in those various sections. And there would be some regular sections as well as some honors sections that would maybe show some interesting comparisons about students' preparedness in information literacy. So I was very excited to do this. They were only going to make it optional, which I think was fine. I think I would still get a good amount of students to take the assessment. They were all agreed to offer a few points of extra credit for completing the survey. So I was planning to run it close to the end of the semester where students were probably very grateful to have just a few extra credit points. But as I mentioned, IRB kind of got in the way, and so I wasn't able to launch it in the spring. But hence the small and mighty test was born. And I'll talk a little bit more about the development and how I went through and kind of went through the steps of revising some of those questions. So I did share it with my information literacy coordinator. I want to give a big shout out to Amber Willenborg. She was super helpful in this process and gave me a lot of feedback at the beginning, which was part of that dialogue with content experts. That's a big part of test validity. So that was super helpful. I got her feedback first. And then I decided to test the feedback with some of our student assistants. So I'll show an example here, and I will just give the caveat, I was rushing it a little bit because I wanted to try to do that this semester and I wanted to get through IRB. So I think I definitely could have tested with more students. I ended up testing with 3 students, but I literally just went up to the desk where they were working and said, hi, I'm the science librarian. You might not know me, but can you please take this test for me? And kind of like hung around while they took the test and then kind of asked them about it and had them mark comments as they were going. I did, however, get students from I had like a freshman, a sophomore, a junior in different majors like studio art or psychology. So I think I did end up getting at least a few different types of students that might react to this assessment differently. So here's a question as an example. So this student got this question right. What's a key component of academic integrity? Summarizing sources and providing citations. But they did have some questions still about academic integrity and what it meant to summarize sources. So they made the comment, generally summarized, am I summarizing the entire source or just a part of it? And then they also had questions about some of the answers that weren't correct. So for example, they said it wasn't necessarily inherently bad to share citations with a classmate and use them in their paper. So that was really interesting too. Students had very complex ideas about academic integrity that might influence how they would respond to that question. So I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, we're doing good. So I'm going to cover some of the revisions that I made to some of these test items. So as I mentioned when I was asking for the test validity, I did align these questions with one or two information literacy frames from the ACR framework, and then drafted questions, which, as soon as I was finished, I was like, this is a great assessment. These questions are awesome. But after getting feedback from other people, I saw a lot of areas for improvement that really enhance this assessment rather than me just like coming up with questions and doing the survey and kind of seeing what happened. But you can see here, based on that student feedback, I clarified some of the multiple choice answers. So for example, really clarifying things that would be considered academic dishonesty. So in this example, using previous classwork for another class without permission from your instructor. So making that a little bit clear. And then changing that last question to copying citations from a classmate from a paper on a different topic. So really trying to kind of clarify what would be considered academic honesty versus academic dishonesty. So it seemed that students would be able to answer that question a little bit better. Another question, for example, which was aligned with the frame's information creation as a process and searching as strategic exploration, was the question that first started out as what kind of information source would be best to find a basic fact about a biological topic? And I think this is very emblematic of like a first draft. It's like, that makes sense to me. But when students read it, they were like, well, what do you mean a biological topic? I think I would look for things in different places depending on what the fact actually was. So I made that more specific and said what kind of information source would be best to find descriptions of the habitats of alpine birds. So the answer to that question, I was really trying to get them to think about reference sources and how that might contain different information than a scholarly article. So I thought that kind of source type question would be important to include, but would be enhanced by some more specificity in the assessment. And the last one I'll mention, again, is kind of related to the information creation as a process frame and authority is constructed and contextual. And this is that retraction question. I was really interested in retraction at the time, and I think it's important to teach students. But even I kind of had some questions about like, well, what does happen when an article is retracted? Could it be different depending on the context? So I was considering cutting this question altogether, but I was able to get some feedback that I could make instead the question be framed as what does a journal do? So the multiple choice answers are a little bit different. Do they ban the researchers? Do they remove the article from the website, which usually is not the case? Do they remove the peer reviewers from the pool? And then finally, that correct answer, issuing a formal notice explaining the retraction and labeling the article as retracted. So I think that question became much better after iterative refinement. So I just want to talk a little bit about some next steps, and then I have an activity for everyone to do. So don't worry, I'll I'll continue this conversation with you all. So some of the next steps, I did finally get IRB approval in the summer, but of course nothing's happening in the summer, and faculty, are still kind of there, but maybe not as responsive. So I haven't reached back out to the 242 instructors again, but I do think I might have to identify either a new course if I want to run the assessment in the fall, or wait for the larger number of sections of Biology 242 to be offered in the spring. I think I still could pilot it in the fall and get that larger sample in the spring. But again, it really depends on the instructors. I anticipate it will be a different group again, but I think some of the same. There are coordinators who work with those classes frequently. So I do think I still have buy-in to run the assessment, but I'm still going to have to like follow up and pester people and be like, okay, this is still a thing. Can we still do this? I think the next steps after that, once I get the data, and again, I'm sorry I wasn't able to share any of this with you all, any data with you all in this presentation, but then the fun part of running statistical analysis of results. So that would be things like descriptive statistics and various measures such as Crohn's-Bach alpha or ANOVA. I will fully admit that I'm not talking about that much in the presentation because I'm still learning about that as well. I really want to get the data first, and then I have some colleagues at other universities that are going to help me who are statistic pros that are going to teach me a lot about it. So I'll get to that at some point as well. But those are some of the types of analyses that you could do with this type of assessment. Then after running the assessment, then I'll go back and revisit the tutorial design and really make that tutorial informed by the assessment and not just what I think students should know or what I think they already know. But again, still developing learning outcomes and aligning the assessment with learning outcomes, but also informed that way. And then, of course, I can test again after the tutorial implementation, but kind of like what I was saying with the pre-post test, I think you have to be really cautious if you're making claims about the effectiveness of such a small scale intervention like a standalone tutorial. So I think it better would maybe be to test students maybe at this 200 level and then at the capstone level. And that's not necessarily measuring how effective I am as a science librarian, although I would love to have data to show that I'm a great instruction librarian and students are learning lots from me. But I think rather that's kind of that assessment approach that I was taking, that we're looking at a student holistically and considering, yeah, maybe they did learn a lot in that resuscitation session from a GA, or maybe the tutorial was super transformative. We can't really pinpoint that with assessment. That's not really the point of assessment either, but there's still kind of small steps that we can take. So we have some time left, and I saw some things in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slide. It's the end of the day. You got to do one more Padlet. So if you still have the energy to do this, please bear with me because I think this provides some space and opportunity for you to think about questions that you might want to ask students. I know we have people from K through 12 and from special libraries, so I think your questions would look a lot different than what I would do for STEM students, but I'm really interested to know what you would do. Let me just drop a link to this in the chat so that's easier for you all to click on. So we'll only spend maybe like 5 minutes. We can end a little early. I know it's a long day. We'll see what is generated in the discussion. But while I have you all starting that, and I'll just show really quickly too, I think other people have done Padlets today, but I did put columns of the different ACRL framework frames, and you can click on the plus sign underneath it and put your question here. You can give it a subject or just put your question here or write it underneath. And I am also going to add section for other, just in case you want to come up with questions that aren't aligned with the framework at all. That's fine too. So I'll go ahead and leave this slide up. And while you all are working on that, I'm going to catch up on the chat and then we can address that as well. So thanks. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay, I'm just gonna talk while you all are coming up with your questions because I am loving what's happening in the chat. So we had some people say that they had similar questions in quick polls and LibGuides, or even some ebooks had some pre-post test questions that it sounds like they were able to access and could, measure some IL skills. So that's really interesting. Some people are chiming in to say why they didn't say if something, was appropriately measuring an HL frame. And there's some really great conversations happening that I didn't even think about. Some people answered no because they were skeptical that one question could fully reflect what students know. And I think that's definitely true. I think maybe I misconstrued what I was saying in terms of reflection. I think I was thinking in terms of that validation, like, is this really measuring this concept, which, is a super large concept. I think the assessment questions were one small piece that were kind of inspired by knowledge practices and dispositions in the frame, but I really appreciate that critical perspective. And it sounds like people had some similar thoughts. There's also a lot of overlap. Yeah, I agree. There's not a good way for a specific question to accurately measure everything contained by any one frame. I think, again, we see that a lot too, where it's like an information literacy one-shot session can't cover all of the ACRL framework. That's not what the framework was intended to do. So I think that's a good reminder. But yeah, I just want to also clarify that I wouldn't be asking students whether they think it relates to the framework. This was just for this activity today. But I do think it would be interesting if there was more conversation and discussion with students around the framework in an audience appropriate way, then they might have feedback on that as well. Yeah, but maybe I could have worded that question better. They appropriately relate to, not necessarily measure. Sounds like some people at other institutions like EKU are doing assessments. I would love to see those. That's awesome. Someone is making some connections with nursing. Yeah, my questions are really STEM focused, but things could look very different depending on the discipline. Someone mentioned if you can connect the assessment to a specific course competency or assignment outcome as well as an IEL outcome. Yeah, I think that would be really great. I don't think I specifically saw the Biology 242 outcomes, but as I mentioned, there wasn't like a super big research component, so I didn't really expect it to be an outcome, but that's definitely something I can follow up on with folks. Some more people are chiming in. Let's see. I think I'm just seeing that again. Okay. Well, let's see. We've been doing some questions for a little bit. I'm just gonna hop over to the Padlet to look at them. Nice. It looks like we've got some cool ones. So, I think it's helpful if people are just like tuning in and listening. I can read some of them out loud because it looks like they're really great. So, thinking about authority as constructed and contextual, what role does Indigenous knowledge play in the scholarly conversation in the Western world? I think that would be super interesting. I'm really interested in doing that more with STEM education. I'm not necessarily sure how it's addressed already in the curriculum. I think it very likely could be, but I know that's a big component of the STEM companion document to the ASHL framework. So I really like that question. Another question could be, what level of credibility does a fire marshal with 15 years of experience have when searching for information about fire codes? Yeah, this is a really great one, and I think it adopts some specificity that I didn't initially have in questions. So it's great that you're already thinking about being really explicit about the context when you're asking students, especially about some of these muddy concepts like authority. Um, some examples of information creation as a process. We are all consumers and creators of info. Have you made a TikTok? Do you have an Instagram? Do you typically post first, or what have you scanned for your feed? I do want to make a comment about kind of why I went with multiple choice questions. I think it really was just, it kind of aligned really well with the STEM audience. I think students are really used to taking multiple choice questions in STEM, and I've really been noticing that faculty are really heavily assessing students on multiple choice questions and kind of shy away a little bit from open response questions. So although I do have the one open response question on my assessment, I kind of was thinking about my audience when I was choosing multiple choice. It wasn't my first reaction. I'm like, but no, wait, I could get so much better assessment data if I asked all open-ended questions. But that would be a lot of data to go through, and I really just wanted to test this quick and dirty assessment out first. But yeah, I think reflective questions, I agree, would get a lot more data. So another example would be, given the research question, what movie in 2002 made the most money? Which words are keywords or the words that might need to be revised? Yeah, I think that there was an example of a keyword question, I think, and that could be helpful too. Moving on to information has value. How might your access to information now as a college student differ from what you might have after college? Yeah, I think that's really great. And another good open-ended question that would maybe have some really rich responses that wouldn't necessarily fall well into multiple choice answers. Research as inquiry. What are some subtopics or related ideas about the research interest health in rural areas? Yeah, definitely choosing examples that are related to the discipline. I think, again, that's one of the benefits of doing your own assessment rather than relying on something like Tattle, is that you can be really specific to your context and use maybe concepts that are already discussed in the course, or things that you know are personally relevant to your student body. So that's really great as well. Just a few more. Scholarship is conversation. What does historiography mean within the context of changing opinions on historical personages and events? Yeah, another good one. What wikis could be considered scholarly and reliable? That could be interesting. I think you could also frame that, again, if you really were into doing like multiple choice or true false. I think it would be interesting to ask, like, do you think Wikipedia is a credible source? Yes or no? And maybe an open response of them saying why would be interesting. I know I do a lot of instruction around Wikipedia, and people are like, no, it's not credible. And I'm like, but it can be. And I know a lot of people do that too. So, um, searching a strategic exploration. How has your research style changed from experience in using the library? That's interesting. What types of research is Google ideal for, and what types of research are library databases ideal for? Yeah, some really great examples. So, I'll keep this up. I just want to make a few comments too at the end about how I kind of I didn't struggle coming up with questions. I really had fun with it. And again, it kind of tested my ability to make them multiple choice rather than open ended. It made it harder for me to do, I think. But I do think there needs to be more opportunities for librarians to share these types of assessment questions with each other. There is the ACRL framework sandbox that I did look through, and there's even like an assessment tag. And maybe I didn't spend the most time with it. It can be kind of hard to use, but there really isn't a very good repository of current modern questions that are aligned with the framework and some of the other ideas that librarians have been teaching with. And I think a resource like that would be really great, and I would benefit greatly from it. So I don't know if that's something that like librarians in Kentucky would be interested, or in other areas. I think it could be great to compile some of these questions together. And it really that goes back to how do we validate these questions? Are we really measuring what we want to measure? I was super interested to hear. Maybe there was some confusion in the phrasing, but maybe some of the questions I developed aren't really addressing the framework. And how can I revise those questions to better reflect some of the theoretical or the constructs that we look at as librarians? So I'll leave my email up. We'll end a little bit early. Yeah, I think that would be nice. I know it's been a long 2 days. I'm going to look at the chat really quickly and read some more things, but I'm happy to take questions in the last couple of minutes. Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. I'd be happy to just get comments too. I know people have lots of opinions about assessment, so yeah, someone mentioned that multiple choices is challenging in thinking about lower and higher order thinking. It is easier to grade though. I think that was the other reason too. I forgot to mention that the biology instructors really wanted to do the assessment in Blackboard. And Blackboard can be a little clunky, but they were like, oh, just do the test, we'll export the data and give it to you, and you can run the analysis, and that'll be it. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang out for a few more minutes to answer questions, but I appreciate your attention. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my slides, but I'll also put my email in the chat.